But if you really dislike the idea so much, I could tell one of the Ashaman. You'd be safe at the Black Tower. Anila squeaked prettily, but her face went gray. Thank you, no, Ailil said after a moment, absolutely calm. I suppose I had best confer with my lance captain about what to expect. But she paused in turning her mare away, and regarded Rand with a sidelong look. My brother Toram is impetuous, my Lord Dragon. Even rash. I am not. Anila smiled much too sweetly at Rand, and actually wriggled slightly before following. But once she faced away from him, she dug in her heels and worked her jewel-handled quirt, quickly passing the other woman. That white gelding showed a surprising turn of speed. At last all was ready. The columns formed, snaking back over the low hills. Begin, Rand told Gedwin, who wheeled his horse and began barking orders to his men. The 8 dedicated rode forward and dismounted on the ground they had memorized, facing the mountains. One of them looked familiar. A grizzled fellow whose pointed Tyran beard appeared odd on his wrinkled countryman's face. 8 vertical lines of sharp blue light turned and became openings that showed slightly different views of a long, sparsely wooded mountain valley rising to a steep pass. In Altara. In
Hey,
the
big movie
mountains.
fan, how you doing?
Kill them, Luce Theron wept pleadingly.
I hope you're
They're
doing
too
well.
dangerous to live. Without thought, Rand suppressed the voice. Another man channeling often brought that reaction from Luce Theron, or even a man who could. He no longer wondered why.
Hey, Christopher, how you doing?
Rand muttered a command,
Good to see you.
and Flynn blinked in surprise before hurrying to join the line and weave a 9th gateway. None was as large as Rand could make, but any would pass a cart, if closely. He had intended to do that himself, but he did not want to chance seizing Saidin again in front of everyone. He noticed Gedwin and Rochide watching him, wearing identical, knowing smiles. And Dashiva as well, frowning, lips moving as he talked to himself. Was it his imagination, or was Narishma eyeing him askance too? And Adley? More? Rand shivered before he could stop himself. Mistrust of Gedwin and Rochide was simple sense, but was he coming down with what Nynaeve had...
Salut Chris, j'espère que tu vas bien. C'est bon de te voir.
Down with what Nynaeve had called the dreads, a kind of madness, a crippling dark suspicion of everyone and everything. There had been a Copland, Benley, who thought everybody was scheming against him. He had starved to death when Rand was a boy, refusing to eat for fear of poison. Ducking low on Tidashar's neck, Rand heeled the gelding through the largest gateway. Flynn's, as it happened, but he would have ridden through one made by Gedwin right then. He was the first onto Altaran soil. The others followed quickly, the Ashaman first of all. Dashiva started in Rand's direction, frowning, and Narishma too, but Gedwin immediately began directing his soldiers. One by one, they rushed forward, opened a gateway, and darted through, dragging their mounts behind them. Ahead up the valley, bright flashes of light told of gateways opening and closing. The Ashaman could travel short distances without first memorizing the ground they left from, and cover ground far easier than riding. In short order, only Gedwin and Rochide remained, aside from the dedicated holding the gateways. The others would be fanning out westward, searching for Sean.
Oh, yeah. I got an appointment early.
From Ilion and
I always hate earlier appointments.
Legion men spread into the trees at a trot, crossbows held ready.
I'm doing okay.
In this
I can't
country,
complain
they
too
can
much.
move as fast afoot as
Well,
men
I
on horseback.
can, but
As the rest of the army began emerging,
you know how that
Rand
goes.
rode up the valley in the direction the Ashaman had gone.
Hey, oh, you playing
Mountains
Sniper
rose
Elite
high
5?
behind him, a wall
Nice.
fronting the deep. But west, the peaks ran
That's a
almost
pretty
to
good one.
He quickened the gelding's pace to a canter. Bashir caught him before he reached the pass.
How are you liking it?
The man's bay was small. Most of the Saldaeans rode small horses, but quick. No Shang-Chan here, it seems, he said almost idly, stroking his mustaches with a knuckle. But there could have been. Zenobia is likely to have my head on a pike soon enough for following a live dragon reborn. Much more a dead one. Rand scowled. Maybe he could take Flynn to watch his back, and Narishma. Flynn had saved his life. It had to be true. Men could change, though. And Narishma? Even after... He felt cold at the risk he had taken. Not the dreads. Narishma had proved true, but it still had been a mad risk. As mad as running from stairs he was not even sure were real. Running to where he had no notion what was waiting. Bashir was right, but Rand did not want to talk about it further. The slopes leading up into the pass were bare stone and boulders of all sizes, but among the natural stone lay weathered pieces of what must have once been a huge statue. Some were just recognizable as worked stone, others more so. A beringed hand, nearly big as his chest, gripping a sword hilt with a broken stub of blade wider than his hand. A great head. A woman with cracks across her face and a crown that seemed to be made of upthrusting daggers, some still whole. Who do you think she was? He asked. Queen, of course. Even if merchants or scholars had worn crowns in some distant time, only rulers and generals earned statues. Bashir twisted in his saddle to study the head before speaking. A queen of Shiota, I'll wager, he said finally. Not older. I saw a statue made in Aharon once, and it was so worn you couldn't say whether it was man or woman. A conqueror, they wouldn't have shown her with a sword. And I seem to recall Shiota gave a crown like that to rulers who expanded the borders. Maybe they called it the Crown of Swords, eh? A brown sister might be able to tell you more. It isn't important, Rand told him irritably. They did look like swords. Bashir went on anyway, graying eyebrows lowered, serious. I expect thousands cheered her, called her the hope of Shiota. Maybe even believed she was. In her time, she might have been as feared and respected as Utter Hawkwing was later. But now, even the Brown sisters...
Yeah, you gonna get those no matter what, bro.
When you die, people begin to forget who you were and what you did, or tried to do. Everybody dies eventually, and everybody is forgotten eventually. But there's no bloody point dying before your time comes. I don't intend to, Rand said sharply. He knew where he was meant to die, if not when. He thought he did. The corner of his eye caught motion, back down where bare stone gave way to brush and a few small trees. 50 paces away, a man stepped into the open and raised a bow, smoothly drawing fletchings to cheek. Everything seemed to happen at once. Snarling, Rand hauled Tidashar around, watching the archer adjust to follow. Used Saidin, and Sweet Life and Phil poured into him together. His head spun. There were two archers. Bile rose in his throat as he fought wild, uncontrolled surges of the power that tried to sear him to the bone and freeze his flesh solid. He could not control them. It was all he could do to stay alive. Desperately, he fought to clear his sight, to be able to see well enough to weave the flows he could barely form, with nausea flooding him as strongly as the power. He thought he heard the two archers loosed. Rand should have died. At that range, and away from his target. Maybe being Severin saved him. As the archer let fly, a covey of gray-winged quail burst up almost at his feet, uttering piercing whistles. Not enough to throw off an experienced man, and indeed the fellow only flinched a hair. Rand felt the wind of the arrow's passage against his cheek. Fireballs the size of fists suddenly struck the archer. He screamed as his arm spun away, and still gripping the bow, another took off his left leg at the knee. He fell shrieking. Leaning out of his saddle, Rand vomited onto the ground. His stomach tried to heave up every meal he had ever eaten. The void and Saidin left with a sickening wrench. It was nearly more than he could manage not to fall. When he could sit upright again, he took the white linen handkerchief Bashir silently offered and wiped his mouth. The Saldean frowned with concern, as well he might. Rand's stomach wanted to find more to spew out. He thought his face must be pale. He drew a deep breath. Losing Saidin that way could kill you. But he could still sense the source. At least Saidin had not burned him out. At least he could see properly. There was only one Davram Bashir. But the illness seemed a little worse each time he seized it. Let's see if there's enough of this fellow left to talk, he told Bashir. There was not. Rothschild was on his knees, calmly searching through the corpse's torn, blood-stained coat. Besides his missing arm and leg, the dead man had a blackened hole as big as his head all the way through his chest. It was Egan Padros. His sightless eyes stared at the sky in surprise. Gedwin ignored the body.
Oh, yeah, I appreciate
studying Rand
it.
instead,
Big movie fan.
as cold as Rothschild. Both men held Sydene. Surprisingly, Luce Theron only moaned. In a clatter of hooves on stone, Flynn and Narishma came galloping up the rise, followed by nearly 100 Saldaeans. As they came close, Rand could feel the power in the grizzled old man and the younger, maybe as much as they could hold. They had both leaped up in strength since Dumais Wells. That was the way of it with men. Women seemed to gain smoothly, but men suddenly jumped. Flynn was stronger than Gedwin or Rothschild, either one, and Narishma not far behind. For the time being, there was no way to know how it would end. None came close to matching Rand, though. Not yet, anyway. There was no way to tell what time would bring. Not the dreads. It seems it's well we decided to follow you, my Lord Dragon. Gedwin's voice assumed concern, just shy of mocking. Are you suffering from a tender stomach this morning? Rand just shook his head. He could not take his eyes from Padros's face. Why? Because he had conquered Ilion? Because the man had been loyal to Lord Brand? With a loud exclamation, Rothschild ripped a wash-leather pouch from Padros's coat pocket and upended it. Bright golden coins spilled onto the stony ground, bouncing and clinking. 30 crowns, he growled. Tarvalin crowns. No doubt who paid him. He snatched a coin and tossed it up for Rand, but Rand made no effort to catch it, and it glanced off his arm. There's plenty of Tarvalin coin to be found, Bashir said calmly. Half the men in this valley have a few in their pockets. I do myself. Gedwin and Rothschild swiveled to look at him. Bashir smiled behind his thick mustaches, or at least showed teeth. But some of the Saldaeans shifted uneasily in their saddles and fingered belt pouches. Up where the pass leveled off for a bit between steep mountain slopes, a slash of light rotated into a gateway, and a top-knotted Shanaran in a plain black coat trotted through, pulling his horse behind him. It appeared the first Shonchan had been found, and not too far away if the man was back so quickly. Time to move, Rand told Bashir. The man nodded, but he did not stir. Instead, he studied the two Ashaman standing near Padros. They ignored him. What do we do with him? Gedwin demanded, gesturing to the corpse. We ought to send him back to the witches, at least. Leave him, Rand replied. Are you ready to kill now? Luce Theron asked. He did not sound insane at all. Not yet, Rand thought. Soon. Digging his heels into Tidashar's flanks, he galloped back down toward his army. Dashiva and Flynn followed closely, and Bashir and the 100 Saldaeans. They were all looking around as if they expected another attempt on his life. To the east, black clouds were building among the peaks. Another Cimaros storm. Soon. The hilltop camp was well laid out, with a meandering stream close by for water and good lines of sight to the likeliest ways into the long mountain meadow. Asid Bakun did not feel pride in camp. During 30 years in the ever-victorious army, he had made hundreds of camps. He would as soon have felt pride in walking across a room without falling down. Nor did he feel pride in where he was. 30 years serving the Empress, might she live forever, and while there had been the occasional rebellion by some mad upstart with eyes on the crystal throne, the bulk of those years had been spent preparing for this. For 2 generations, while the great ships were built to carry the return, the ever-victorious army had trained and prepared. Bakun certainly had been proud when he learned he was to be one of the Forerunners. Surely he could be forgiven dreams of retaking the lands stolen from Arthur Hawkwing's rightful heirs, even wild dreams to completing this new consolidation before the Koren came. Not such a wild dream after all, as it turned out, but not at all the way he had imagined. A returning patrol of 50 Tarabana Lancers rode up the hillside, red and green stripes painted across their solid breastplates, veils of mail hiding their thick mustaches. They rode well, and even fought well, when they had decent leaders. More than 10 times as many were already among the cook fires or down the picket lines tending their mounts, and 3 patrols were still out. Bakun had never expected to find himself with well over half his command descendants of thieves. And ashamed of it. They would look you straight in the eyes. The patrol's commander bowed low to him as their muddy-legged horses passed, but many of the others went on talking in their peculiar accents, speaking too fast for Bakun to understand without listening hard. They had peculiar notions of discipline, too. Shaking his head, Bakun strode across to the Suldam's large tent. Larger than his, of necessity. 4 of them were sitting on stools outside, in their dark blue dresses with the forked lightning on the skirts, enjoying the sun during this break in the storms. Those were rare enough now. The gray-clad Damani sat at their feet, with Nerith braiding her pale hair. Talking to her as well, all of them joining in and laughing softly. The bracelet on the end of the silvery Edam's leash lay on the ground. Bakun grunted sourly. He had a favorite wolfhound back home, and even talked to him sometimes, but he never expected Nip to carry on a conversation. "Is she well?" he asked Nerith, not for the first time, or the 10th. "Is everything well with her?" The Damani dropped her eyes and went silent. "She is quite well, Captain Bakun." A square-faced woman, Nerith put the proper degree of respect into her voice, and not a whisker beyond. But she stroked the Damani's head soothingly while she talked. "Whatever the indisposition, it is gone now. A small thing in any case. Nothing to worry about." The Damani was trembling. Bakun grunted again, not far from the answer he had received before. Something had been wrong, though, back in Ebudar, and not just with this Damani. The Suldam had all been as tight-lipped as clams, and the blood would not say anything, of course, not to the likes of him. But he had heard too many whispers. They said the Damani were all sick or insane. Light he had not seen a single one used around Ebudar once the city was secured, not even for a victory display of skylights, and who had ever heard the like of that? "Well, I hope she," he began, and cut off as a Rakan appeared, sweeping through the eastern pass. Its great leathery wing bent powerfully for height, and right above the hill it suddenly tilted and cut a tight circle, one wingtip pointed almost straight down. A thin red streamer fell away under the weight of a lead ball. Bakun swallowed a curse. Flyers were always showing off, but if this pair injured one of his men delivering their scouting report, he would have their hides no matter who he had to face to get them. He would not have wanted to fight without flyers to scout, but they were coddled like some blood's favorite pet. Arrow straight, the streamer plummeted. The lead weight struck the ground and bounced on the crest, almost beside the tall, thin message pole, which was too long to lower unless there was a message to send. Besides, when it was let down, somebody was always stepping a horse on the thing and breaking the joins. Bakun strode straight to his tent, but his first lieutenant was already waiting with the mud-stained streamer and the message tube. Tyrus was a bony man, a head taller than him, with an unfortunate scrap of beard clinging to the point of his chin. The report rolled up in the thin metal tube. On a slip of paper Bakun could almost see through, was written simply. He had never been forced to ride on Rakan or Torakan, the light be thanked, and the Empress, might she live forever, be praised. But he doubted it was easy to handle a pen in a saddle strapped to the back of a flying lizard. What it said made him flip open the lid of his small camp desk and write hurriedly. "There's a force not 10 miles east of here," he told Tyrus. 5 or 6 times our number. Flyers exaggerated sometimes, but not often by much. How had that many penetrated these mountains so far without being spotted before? He had seen the coast to the east, and he wanted his burial prayers paid before he tried a landing there. Burn his eyes, the flyers boasted they would see a flea move anywhere in the range. No reason to think they know we're here, but I'd not mind a few reinforcements. Tyrus laughed. We'll give them a brush of the Damani, and that will be that if they outnumber us by 20 times. His only real fault was a touch of overconfidence. A good soldier, though. And if they have a few Aes Sedai, Raccoon said quietly, hardly stumbling over the name as he stuffed the flyer's report back into the tube with his own brief message. He had not really believed anyone could let those women run free. Tyrus's face showed that he remembered the tales about an Aes Sedai weapon. The red streamer floated behind him as he ran with the message tube. Soon enough, tube and streamer were attached to the tip of the message pole, a tiny breeze stirring the long red strip 15 paces above the hill crest. The Rockin soared toward it, along the valley, outstretched wings still as death. Abruptly, one of the flyers swung down from the saddle and hung, upside down, below the Rockin's trailing claws. It made Bakkun's stomach hurt to watch. But her hand closed on the streamer, the pole flexed, then vibrated back upright as the message tube pulled free of the clip, and she scrambled back up as the creature climbed in slow circles. Bakkun thankfully put Rockin and flyers out of his mind as he surveyed the valley. Broad and long, nearly flat except for this hill, and surrounded by steep wooded slopes, only a goat could enter, except by the passes in his sight. With the Damani, he could cut anybody to pieces before they managed to try attacking across that muddy meadow. He had passed word along, though. If the enemy came straight on, they would arrive before any possible reinforcements, by 3 days at best. How had they come this far unseen? He had missed the last battles of the Consolidation by 200 years, but some of those rebellions had not been small. 2 years fighting on Merendala, 30,000 dead, and 50 times that shipped back to the mainland as property. Taking notice of the strange kept a soldier alive. Ordering the camp struck and all signs of it cleared, he began moving his command to the forested slopes. Dark clouds were massing in the east. Another of those cursed storms was coming. Chapter 23. Fog of War, Storm of Battle. No rain fell, for the moment. Rand guided Tidashar around an uprooted tree lying across the slope and frowned down at a dead man sprawled on his back behind the tree trunk. The fellow was short and blocky, his face creased and his armor, all overlapping plates, lacquered blue and green. But staring sightlessly at the black clouds overhead, he looked a deal like Egan Padros, even to the missing leg. An officer, plainly, the sword beside his outflung hand, had an ivory hilt carved in the likeness of a woman, and his lacquered helmet, shaped like some huge insect's head, bore 2 long, thin blue plumes. Uprooted trees and shattered ones, a fair number burning from end to end, littered the slope of the mountain for a good 500 paces. Bodies, too, men broken or ripped apart when Saidin harrowed the mountainside. Most wore steel veils across their faces and breastplates painted in horizontal stripes. No women, thank the light. The injured horses had been put down, another thing to be thankful for. It was incredible how loudly a horse could scream. Do you think the dead are silent? Lews Theron's laugh was rasping. Do you? His voice turned to pained rage. The dead howl at me. At me too, Rand thought sadly. I can't afford to listen, but how do you shut them up? Lews Theron began weeping for his lost Ilyena. A great victory, Wyroman intoned behind Rand, then muttered, but small honor in it.
Yeah, cheers,
Gold
Chris.
rings are best. Mud liberally decorated Rand's coat, yet surprisingly, Wireman appeared as pristine as he had back on the Silver Road. His helmet and armor shone. How had he managed? The Tarabanners charged, at the end, lances and courage against the one power, and Wireman had led his own charge to break them. Without orders, and followed by every tyrant save the defenders, even a half-drunk Torian, surprisingly. By Samaradrid and Gregorin Pana, too, with most of the Carianan and Ilianers. Standing still had been hard by that time, and every man wanted to come to grips with something he actually could come to grips with. The Ashaman could have done it faster, if somewhat more messily. Rand had taken no part in the fighting, except to sit his saddle where men could see him. He had been afraid to seize the power. He did not dare display weakness to catch. Not a scrap. Lews Theron gibbered with horror at the very idea. Equally surprising as Wireman's unsullied face, Anila rode with him, and for once not simpering. Her face was pinched and disapproving. Strangely, it did not spoil her looks nearly so much as her unctuous smiles did. She had not joined the charge herself, of course, any more than Ailil. But Anila's master of the horse had, and the man was most definitely dead, with a Tarabanner lance through his chest. She did not like that one bit. But why did she accompany Wireman? Just tyrants flocking together? Maybe. She had been with Sunaman, the last Rand had seen. Bashir walked his bay up the slope, picking his way around the dead while seeming to pay them no more mind than he did a splintered tree trunk or a burning stump. His helmet hung from his saddle, and his gauntlets were stuffed behind his sword belt. He was mud all down his back, and his horse as well. Arakom's gone, he said. Flynn tried healing him, but I don't think Arakom wanted to live like that. There's near 50 dead so far, and some of the rest might not survive. Anila paled. Rand had seen her near Arakom, emptying herself. Dead commoners did not affect her so much. Rand felt a moment of pity, not for her, and not very much for Arakom. For Min, though she was safely back in Carian. Min had foretold Arakom's death from one of her viewings, and Gwayam and Marakon's too. Whatever she had seen, Rand hoped it had not been anywhere near the reality. Most of the soldiers were off scouting again, but down in the broad meadow, gateways woven by Gedwin's dedicated were spilling out the supply carts and the remounts. The men coming with them gaped as soon as they were clear enough to see. The muddy ground was not so well plowed as the mountainside, yet blackened furrows, 2 paces wide and 50 long, carved through the brown grass, and gaping holes a horse might not be able to leap. They had not found the Damani so far. Rand thought there had to be only one. More would have done considerably greater damage under the circumstances. Men moved around a number of small fires where water boiled for tea, among other things. For once, Tyrants, Carianan, and Ilianers mingled. Not just the commoners. Samaradrid was sharing his saddle flask with Gwayam, who wearily rubbed a hand over his bald head. Marakan and Kirill Drapaneos, a stork of a man whose square-cut beard looked odd on his narrow face, were squatting on their heels near one of the fires. Playing cards, by the look of it. Torian had a whole circle of laughing Carianan lordlings around him, though they might have been less amused by his jokes than by the way he swayed and rubbed at his potato nose. The Legion men kept apart, but they had taken in the volunteers who had followed Padros to the Banner of Light. That lot seemed more eager than anyone since learning how Padros died. Blue-coated Legion men were showing them how to change direction without falling apart like a gaggle of geese. Flynn was among the wounded with Adley and Moore and Hopwell. Narishma could heal little more than minor cuts, no better than Rand. And Dashiva, not even that. Gedwin and Rochide stood talking well apart from anyone else, holding their horses by the reins atop the hill in the middle of the valley. The hill where they had expected to catch the Shonchan by surprise when they rushed out of gateways surrounding it. Near 50 dead and more to come, but it would have been above 200 without Flynn and the rest who could manage healing to one degree or another. Gedwin and Rothschild had not wanted to dirty their hands and grimaced when Rand drove them to it. One of the dead was a soldier, and another soldier, a round-faced Kyrianan, sat slumped beside a fire with a dazed look that Rand hoped came from being tossed through the air by the ground erupting almost under his feet. Down there on the furrowed flats, Eilil was conferring with her lance captain, a pale little man called Denharid. Their horses stood nearly touching, and occasionally they looked up the mountain toward Rand. Were they scheming? "We'll do better next time," Bashir murmured. He ran his gaze around the valley, then shook his head. "The worst mistake is to make the same one twice, and we won't." Wireman heard him and repeated the same thing, but using 20 times the words, and flowery enough for a garden in spring, without admitting there had been any mistakes, certainly on his part. He avoided Rand's mistakes with equal adroitness. Rand nodded, his mouth tight. Next time they would do better. They had to, unless he wanted to leave half his men buried in these mountains. Right then, he was wondering what to do with the prisoners. Most of those who escaped death on the mountainside had managed to withdraw through the trees that remained standing. With amazingly good order, considering, Bashir claimed. Yet they were unlikely to be much threat now. Not unless they had the Damani with them. But 100 or so men sat huddled on the ground, stripped of weapons and armor, under the watchful eyes of 24 mounted companions and defenders. Tarabanners for the most part, they had not fought like men driven to it by conquerors. A fair number held their heads up and jeered at their guards. Gedwin had wanted to kill them after putting them to the question. Wireman did not care whether they had their throats slit, but he considered torture a waste of time. None of them would know anything useful, he maintained. There was not a one nobly born. Rand glanced at Bashir. Wireman was still going on sonorously. "Sweep these mountains clean for you, my Lord Dragon. We'll trample them beneath our hooves, and—" Annihilo was nodding grim approval. "6 up and half a dozen down," Bashir said softly. He scraped mud from one of his thick mustaches with a fingernail. "Or as some of my tenants say, what you gain on the swings, you lose on the roundabouts." What in the light was a roundabout? A great help that was. And then one of Bashir's patrols made matters worse. The 6 men came prodding a prisoner along the slope ahead of their horses with the butts of their lances. She was a black-haired woman in a torn and dirty dark blue dress with red panels on the breast and skirts bearing forked lightning. Her face was dirty too and tear-streaked. She stumbled and half fell, but the prodding was more gesture than actual touching. She glared scornfully at her captors, even spitting once. She sneered at Rand, too. "Did you hurt her?" he demanded. A strange question, perhaps, about an enemy after what had happened in this valley. About a Suldam. But it popped out. "Not any of us, my Lord Dragon," the gruff-faced patrol leader said. "We found her like this." Scratching his chin through a black flowing beard, he eyed Bashir as if for support. "She claims we killed her Jilla. A pet dog or cat or some such, the way she carries on. Her name's Nerith. We got that much out of her." The woman turned and snarled at him again. Rand sighed. Not a pet dog. No, that name did not belong on the list, but he could hear the litany of names reciting itself in his head, and Jilla the Damani was there. Luce Theron moaned for his Ilyena. Her name also was on the list. Rand thought it had a right. "This is a Shonchan Aes Sedai?" Annihilo asked suddenly, leaning over the pommel of her saddle to peer hard at Nerith. Nerith spat at her as well, eyes widening in outrage. Rand explained the little he knew of Suldam, that they controlled women who could channel with the aid of a leash and collar Terangrial, but could not themselves channel, and to his surprise, the dainty, simpering high lady said coldly, "If my Lord Dragon feels constrained, I'll hang her for him." Nerith spat at her again, contemptuously this time. No shortfall of courage there. "No," Rand growled. Like the things people would do to get on his good side. Or maybe Anayala had been closer to her master of the horse than was considered proper. The man had been stout and balding, and a commoner. That counted heavily with Tyrans. But women did have strange tastes in men. He knew that for a pure fact. As soon as we're ready to move again, he told Bashir, turn the men down the road. Taking prisoners along when he launched his next attack was out of the question, and leaving 100 men, 100 now, more later for sure, leaving them to follow with the supply carts risked 50 kinds of mischief. They could cause no trouble left behind. Even the fellows who had gotten away on horseback could not carry a warning faster than he could travel. Bashir shrugged faintly. He thought it might be so, but then again there was always the odd chance. Strange things happened, even without a Taviran around. Wyraman and Anayala opened their mouths almost together, faces set in protest, but Rand pressed on. I've spoken, and it's done. We'll keep the woman, though, and any more women we capture. Burn my soul, Wyraman exclaimed. Why? The man appeared dumbfounded, and for that matter, Bashir gave a startled jerk of his head. Anayala's mouth twisted in contempt before she managed to turn it to a simpering smile for the Lord Dragon. Plainly, she thought him too soft to send a woman off with the others. They would have hard walking in this terrain, not to mention short rations, and the weather was not weather to turn a woman out in. I have enough Aes Sedai against me without sending Suldam back to their trade, he told them. The Light knew that was true. They nodded, if Wyraman was slow about it. Bashir looked relieved, Anayala disappointed. But what to do with the woman, and any more he captured? He did not intend to turn the Black Tower into a prison. The Aiel could hold them, except that the Wise Ones might slit their throats the moment his back was turned. What about the sisters that Matt was taking to Camelin with Elaine, though? When this is done, I'll hand her over to some Aes Sedai I choose. They might see it as a gesture of goodwill, a little honey to sweeten their having to accept his protection. No sooner were the words out of his mouth than Nereth's face went dead white, and she screamed at the top of her lungs. Howling without cease, she flung herself down the slope, scrabbling over downed trees, falling and scrambling back up. Bloody... Catch her! Rand snapped, and the Saldaean patrol leaped after the woman, jumping their mounts across the tree-littered slope, careless of broken legs and necks. Still wailing, she dodged and darted among the horses with even less care. In the mouth of the easternmost pass, a gateway opened in a flash of silver light. A black-coated soldier pulled his horse through, jumped to the saddle as the gateway winked out, and put his mount to a gallop toward the hilltop where Gedwin and Rochide waited. Rand watched impassively. In his head, Lews Therin snarled of killing all the Ashaman before it was too late. By the time the three of them started up the slope toward Rand, 4 of the Saldaeans had Nereth down on the ground, binding her hand and foot. It took 4, the way she thrashed and bit at them, and an amused Bashir was offering odds on whether she might not overcome them instead. Anayala muttered something about cracking the woman's head. Did she mean cracking it open? Rand frowned at her. The soldier between Gedwin and Rochide glanced at Nereth uneasily as they rode past. Rand vaguely remembered seeing him at the Black Tower, the day he first handed out the silver swords and gave Taim the very first dragon pin. He was a young man, Varl Nensen by name, still wearing a transparent veil to cover his thick mustaches. He had not hesitated when he found himself facing his countrymen, though. Allegiance was to the Black Tower and the Dragon Reborn, now, so Taim always said. The second part of that always sounded an afterthought. You may have the honor of making your report to the Dragon Reborn, Soldier Nensen, Gedwin said, wryly. Nensen sat up straight in his saddle. My Lord Dragon, he barked, slapping fist to chest. There's more of them about 30 miles west, my Lord Dragon. 30 miles was as far as Rand had told the scouts to go before returning. What good if one soldier found Shonchan while the rest kept moving ever farther west? Maybe half what we're here, Nensen went on. And His dark eyes flickered toward Nerith again. She was tied now, the Saldaeans struggling to get her over a horse. "And I saw no sign of women, my Lord Dragon." Bashir squinted at the sky. Dark clouds lay in a blanket from mountain peak to mountain peak, but the sun should still be high. "Time to feed the men before the rest return," he said, nodding in satisfaction. Nerith had managed to sink her teeth into a Saldaean's wrist and was hanging on like a badger. "Feed them quick," Rand said irritably. Would every Suldam he captured be as difficult? Very likely. Light, what if they took a Damani? "I don't want to spend all winter in these mountains." Jilla the Damani. He could not erase a name once it went onto that list. "The dead are never silent," Lews Therin whispered. "The dead never sleep." Rand rode down toward the fires. He did not feel like eating. From the point of a thrusting shoulder of stone, Furik Kharid carefully studied the forested mountains rising all around him, sharp peaks like dark fangs. His horse, a tall, dappled gelding, stiffened his ears as though catching a sound he had missed, but otherwise the animal was still. Every so often, Kharid had to stop and wipe the lens of his looking glass. A light rain fell from a gray morning sky. His helmet's two black plumes were bent over instead of standing straight, and water ran down his back. A light rain compared to yesterday, anyway, and probably compared to tomorrow, or this afternoon, perhaps. Thunder rumbled ominously in the south. Kharid's concern had nothing to do with weather, though. Below him, the last of 2,300 men snaked through the winding passes, men gathered from 4 outposts. Well mounted, reasonably well led, yet a bare 200 were Shanchan, and just 2 besides himself wore the red and green of the Guard. Most of the remainder were Taraboners. He knew their mettle, but a good third were Amadisians and Altarans, too new to their oaths for any to be sure how they would stand up. Some Altarans and Amadisians had switched allegiance 2 or 3 times already. Tried to, anyway. People this side of the Arath Ocean had no shame. A dozen Suldam rode near the front of the column, and he wished all 12 had leashed Damanis walking by their horses instead of only 2. 50 paces farther on, the 10 men of the spearhead were watching the slopes above them, though not as carefully as they should have. Too many men who rode spearhead relied on the forward scouts to find any dangers. Kharid made a note to speak to them personally. They would do their duties properly after that, or he would send them to the labor levies. Arakan appeared in the east ahead, skimming low over the treetops, twisting and turning to follow the curves of the land like a man running his hand down a woman's back. Peculiar. Marat Arakan, flyers, always liked to soar high unless the sky was actually full of lightning. Kharid lowered the looking glass to watch. "Maybe we'll finally get another scouting report," Jadranka said. To the other officers waiting behind Kharid, not to him. 3 of the 10 matched Kharid's rank, yet few except the blood disturbed a man in the blood-red and nearly black-green of the Deathwatch Guard. Not that many among the blood did. According to the tales he had heard as a child, one of his ancestors, a noble, had followed Luther Payandrag to Shanchan at Otter Hawkwing's command. But 200 years later, with only the north secure, another ancestor tried to carve out a kingdom of his own, and ended sold from the block instead. Perhaps it was so. Many Dakovale claimed noble ancestors, among themselves at least. Few of the blood found such chatter amusing. In any case, Kharid had felt lucky when the choosers picked him out, a sturdy boy, not yet old enough to be assigned duties, and he still felt pride in the ravens tattooed on his shoulders. Many Deathwatch guards went without coat or shirt whenever possible to display those. The humans, anyway. Ogier gardeners were not marked or owned, but that was between them and the Empress. Kharid was Dakovale, and proud of it, like every man of the Guard, the property of the Crystal Throne, body and soul. He fought where the Empress pointed, and would die the day she said die. To the Empress alone did the Guard answer, and where they appeared, They appeared as her hand, a visible reminder of her. No wonder that some among the blood could become uneasy watching a detachment of guardsmen pass. A far better life than mucking at a lord's stables or serving calf to a lady. But he cursed the luck that had sent him into these mountains to inspect the outposts. The rocket darted on westward. The two flyers crouched low in their saddle. There was no scouting report, no message for him. Furyk knew it was his imagination, but the creature's long, outstretched neck somehow looked anxious. Had he been anyone else, he might have been anxious too. There had been few messages for him since his orders 3 days ago to assume command and move east. Each message had thickened the fog more than cleared it. The locals, these Altarans, had moved into the mountains in force, it seemed, but how? The roads along the northern border of this range were patrolled and watched nearly to the border of Ilion by flyers and Marat Torm, as well as horse-mounted parties. What could have made the Altarans decide to show so many teeth, to stand together? A man might find himself in a duel for a look, though they had begun to learn challenging a guardsman was just a slower way of cutting your own throat. But he had seen nobles of this so-called nation trying to sell each other and their queen for the mere suggestion that their own lands might be protected and perhaps those of their neighbor added to them. Natick, a big man with a deceptively mild face, twisted in his saddle to watch the rocket. "I don't like marching blind," he muttered. "Not when the Altarans have managed to put 40,000 men up here. 40 at least." Jadranka snorted so hard that his tall white gelding shifted. Jadranka was the senior of the 3 captains behind Karid, having served as long as Karid himself. A short, thin man with a prominent nose and such airs you might have thought him of the blood. That horse would stand out at a mile. 40,000 or 100, now look. They're scattered from here to the end of the range, too far apart to support one another. Stab my eyes. Likely half are dead already. They must be tangling with outposts everywhere. That's why we aren't getting reports. We're just expected to sweep up the remnants. Karid swallowed a smile. He had hoped Jadranka was not a fool atop his airs. Praise of victors spread quickly, whether they were an army or half a banner. It was the rare defeats that were swallowed in silence and forgotten. So much silence was ominous. "That last report didn't sound like remnants to me," Natick persisted. He was no fool. "There are 5,000 men, not 50 miles ahead of us, and I doubt we'll take them with brooms." Jadranka snorted again. "We'll crush them with swords or brooms. The light burned my eyes. I can hardly wait for a decent engagement. I told the scouts to press on until they found them. I won't have them slipping away from us." "You did what?" Karid said softly. Soft or not, his words jerked every eye toward him, though Natick and a few of the others had to struggle to stop gaping at Jadranka. Scouts told to press ahead? Scouts told what to look for? What had gone unseen for those orders? Before anyone could open his mouth, shouts rose from the men in the pass, screams, and the shrieks of horses. Karid pressed the leather tube of the looking-glass to his eye. Along the pass ahead of him, men and horses were dying under a hail of what he thought must be crossbow bolts. The way they hammered through steel breastplates, exploded through chests protected by mail. Hundreds were down already, hundreds more sagging wounded in their saddles or afoot and running from horses thrashing on the ground. Too many were running. Even as he looked, men still mounted whirled their horses to try fleeing back up the pass. Where in the light were the Suldam? He could not find them. He had faced rebels who had Suldam into money, and they always had to be killed as fast as possible. Maybe the locals had learned that. Suddenly, shockingly, the ground began to erupt in roaring fountains all along the writhing snake of his command, fountains that flung men and horses into the air as easily as dirt and stones. Lightning flashed out of the sky, blue-white bolts shattering earth and men alike. Other men simply exploded, ripped to shreds by nothing he could see. Did the locals have demoni of their own? No, it would be those Aes Sedai. "What are we going to do?" Nalek said. He sounded shaken, as well he might. "Do you think to abandon your men?" Jadraka snarled. "We rally them and attack you." He cut off, gurgling, as Kharid's sword point went neatly into his throat. There were times fools could be tolerated, and times not. As the man toppled from his saddle, Kharid deftly wiped his blade on the gelding's white mane before the animal bolted.
It'll be right
There
back
were
to
times for a
everyone.
little show, too. "We rally what can be rallied, Nadak," he said, as if Jadranka had never spoken, as if he had never been. "We save what can be saved, and fall back." Turning to ride down into the pass where lightnings flashed and thunders roared, he ordered Anghar, a steady-eyed young man with a fast horse, to ride east and report what had transpired here. Perhaps a flyer would see, and perhaps not, though Kharid suspected he knew why they flew low now. He suspected the High Lady Seraph and the generals in Abu Dar already knew what was occurring up here too. Was today the day he died for the Empress? He dug his heels into his horse's flanks. From the flat, thinly treed ridge, Rand peered westward over the forest before him. With the power in him, life so sweet, vileness, oh so vile, he could see individual leaves, but it was not enough. Tidashar stamped a hoof. The jagged peaks behind, to either side and all around, overtopped the ridge by a mile or more. But the ridge stood well above the treetops below, a rolling wooded valley over a league in length and nearly as wide. All was still down there, as quiet as the void he floated in. Quiet for the moment, anyway. Here and there plumes of smoke rose from where 2 or 3 trees in a clump burned like torches. Only the general wet stopped them turning the valley into a conflagration. Flynn and Deshiva were the only Ashaman still with him. All the rest were down in the valley. The pair stood a little way from him at the edge of the trees, holding their horses by the reins and staring at the forest below. While Flynn stared as intently as Rand himself. Deshiva glanced occasionally, twisted his mouth, sometimes muttering to himself, in a way that made Flynn shift his feet and eye him sideways. The power filled both men, nearly to overflowing, but for a change, Lews Theron said nothing. The man seemed increasingly to have gone back into hiding over the last few days. In the sky, there was actually sunlight, and the scattered clouds were gray. It was 5 days since Rand had brought his small army to Altara. 5 days since he had seen his first Shon-Chen dead. He had seen quite a few since. Thought slid across the surface of the void. He could feel the heron branded into his palm, pressing against the dragon scepter through his glove. Silent. There were none of the flying creatures to be seen. 3 of those had died and slashed from the sky by lightning before their riders learned to stay clear. Bashir was fascinated by the creatures. Quiet. "Perhaps it is finished, my Lord Dragon." Ailil's voice was calm and cool, but she patted her mare's neck, though the animal did not need soothing. She eyed Flynn and Deshiva sideways and straightened, unwilling to reveal a shred of unease in front of them. Rand found himself humming and stopped abruptly. That was Lews Theron's habit, looking at a pretty woman, not his. Not his. Liked if he started taking on the fellow's mannerisms, and when he was not there at that. Abruptly, hollow thunder boomed up the valley. Fire fountained out of a tree a good 2 miles away, then again and again, again. Lightning streaked down into the forest not far from where the tall flames had bloomed, single slashes like jagged blue-white lances. A flurry of lightning bolts and fire, and all was still again. No trees had caught fire this time. Some of that had been Saidin, some of it. Shouts rose, dim and distant, from another part of the valley, he thought. Too far for even his Saidin-enhanced ears to hear the crash of steel. Despite everything, not all of the fighting was being done by Ashaman and dedicated and soldiers. Anayala let out a loud breath she must have been holding since the exchange when the power began. Men fighting with steel did not disturb her. Then she patted her mount's neck. The gelding had only flickered an ear. Rand had noticed that about women. Quite often, when a woman was agitated, she tried to soothe others, whether they required soothing or not. A horse would do. Where was Luce Theron? Irritably, he leaned forward to study the forest canopy again. A good many of those trees were evergreens.
Oh,
oak
haven't been
and
too
pine
bad,
and
big movies
leatherleaf,
fan.
and despite
Same
the late
old, same
drought, they
old.
made an effective screen,
Smoking
even to
and
his intensified vision.
listening to books and
As if
gaming.
idly, he touched the narrow bundle under his stirrup leather. He could take a hand and strike blindly. He could ride down into the woods and be able to see 10 paces at most. Down there, he would be a little more effective than one of the soldiers. A gateway opened among the trees a little way along the ridge, silvery slash widening into a hole that showed different trees and thick winter brown underbrush. A copper-skinned soldier with a thin mustache on his upper lip and a small pearl in his ear exited afoot and let the gateway vanish. He was shoving a Suldam ahead of him, with her wrists tied behind her, a handsome woman except for the purple knot on the side of her head. That seemed to go along with her scowl, though, as well as it did with her rumpled, leaf-stained dress. She sneered over her shoulder at the soldier, while he pushed her along the ridgetop to Rand, and then she sneered up at Rand. The soldier stiffened, saluting smartly. "Soldier Arlen Nalam, my Lord Dragon," he barked, staring straight at Rand's saddle. "My Lord Dragon's orders were to bring any women captured to him." Rand nodded. It was only to give him the appearance of doing something, inspecting prisoners to be sure they were what any idiot could see they were. "Take her back to the carts, Soldier Nalam. Then return to the fighting." He almost ground his teeth saying that. Return to the fighting. While Randall Thor, Dragon Reborn and King of Ilion, sat his horse and watched treetops. Nalam saluted again before pushing away the woman ahead of him, but he was not slow about it. She kept peering over her shoulder again, yet not at the soldier this time. At Rand, with wide-eyed, open-mouthed astonishment. For some reason, Nalam did not pull her to a halt until he reached the spot where he had come out. All that was necessary was to go far enough to avoid injuring the horses. "What are you doing?" Rand demanded as Sayadin filled the man. Nalam half turned back to him, hesitating briefly. "It seems easier here. If I use a place, I've already made a gateway, my Lord Dragon. Sayadin feels strange to me here." His prisoner turned to frown at him. After a moment, Rand gestured him to go ahead. Flynn pretended to be interested in his horse's saddle girth, but the balding old man smiled faintly, smugly. Dashiva giggled. Flynn had been the first to mention an odd feel to Sayadin in this valley. Of course, Narishma and Hawkbill had heard him, and Moore added his tales of the strangeness around Abu Dar. Small wonder everyone was claiming to feel something now, though not a one could say what. Sayadin just felt peculiar. Light, with a taint thick on the male half of the source. What else would it feel? Rand hoped they were not all coming down with his new sickness. Nalam's gateway opened and vanished behind him and his prisoner. Rand let himself really feel Sayadin. Life and corruption commingled, ice to make winter's heart seem warm, and fire to make a forge's flames cold. Death waiting for him to slip, wanting him to slip. It did not feel any different, did it? He scowled at where Nalam had disappeared, Nalam and the woman. She was the fourth Suldam taken this afternoon. That made 23 Suldam prisoners with the carts. And 2 Damani, each still in her silvery leash and collar, carried on separate carts. In those collars, they could not walk 3 steps before becoming more violently sick than Rand did, seizing the source. He was not sure the sisters with Matt would be pleased to receive them after all. The first Damani, 3 days before, he had not thought of as a prisoner. A slender woman with pale yellow hair and big blue eyes, she was a Shanchan captive to be freed, he thought. But when he forced a Suldam to remove the woman's collar, her Adam, she screamed for the Suldam to help her and immediately began lashing out with the power. She had even offered her neck for the Suldam to replace the thing. 9 defenders and a soldier died before she could be shielded. Gedwin would have killed her on the spot had Rand not stopped it. The defenders, nearly as uncomfortable around women who could channel as others were around men who could, the defenders still wanted her dead. They had taken casualties in the fighting these past days, but having men killed by a prisoner seemed to offend them. There had been more casualties than Rand had expected. 31 defenders dead and 46 companions. More than 200 among the Legion men and the nobles' armsmen. 7 soldiers and a dedicated, men Rand had never met before they answered his summons to Ilion. Too many, considering that all except the gravest injury could be healed, if a man could only hang on until there was time. But he was driving the Shanchan west, driving them hard. More shouting rose somewhere far off down in the valley. Fire blossomed a good 3 miles to the west, and lightning struck, toppling trees. Trees and stone erupted from a mountainside farther on, strange fountains marching along the slope. The roaring booms swallowed shouts. The Shanchan were retreating. "Get down there," Rand told Flynn and Deshiva. "Both of you. Find Gedwin and tell him I said push! Push!" Deshiva grimaced at the forest below, then began awkwardly tugging his horse along the ridge. The man was ungainly with horses, riding or leading. He nearly tripped over his sword. Flynn looked up at Rand worriedly. "You mean to stay here alone, my Lord Dragon?" "I'm hardly alone," Rand said dryly, glancing at Ailil and Anayla. They had ridden back to their armsmen, almost 200 lancers waiting just short of where the ridge began to slope down to the east. At their head, Din Harid frowned through the face bars of his helmet. He had command of both lots now, and if his concern was for Ailil and Anayla, his fellows still made a show fit to keep away most attackers. Besides, Wyraman had the northern end of this ridge secured so a fly could not pass, he claimed, and Bashir held the south. Without boasting, Bashir just erected a wall of lances without talking about it. And the Shanchan were retreating. "And I'm hardly helpless anyway, Flynn." Flynn actually looked doubtful and scratched his fringe of white hair before saluting and leading his horse toward where Deshiva's gateway was already winking out. Limping along, Flynn shook his head, muttering to himself, fit for Deshiva. Rand wanted to snarl. He could not go mad, and neither could they. Flynn's gateway vanished, and Rand returned to his study of the treetops. It was quiet again, time stretched in stillness. This notion of taking the outposts in the mountains had been a bad one. He was willing to admit that now. In this terrain, you could be half a mile from any army without knowing it. In those tangled woods down there, you could be 10 feet from them without knowing. He needed to face the Shanchan on better ground. He needed... Abruptly, he was fighting Saidin, fighting wild urges that tried to ream out his skull. The void was vanishing, melting beneath the onslaught. Frantic, dazed, he released the source before it could kill him. Nausea twisted his middle. Double vision showed him 2 crowns of swords. Lying on the thick mulch of dead leaves in front of his face. He was on the ground. He could not seem to breathe properly and struggled to suck in air. There was a chip broken off one of the crown's golden laurel leaves, and blood stained several of the tiny golden sword points. A knot of hot pain in his side told him those never-healing wounds had broken open. He tried to push himself up and cried out. In stunned amazement, he stared at the dark fletchings of an arrow stuck through his right arm. With a groan, he collapsed. Something ran down his face. Something dripped in front of his eye. Blood. Vaguely, he became aware of ululating cries. Horsemen appeared among the trees to the north, galloping along the ridge, some with lowered lances, some working short bows as fast as they could knock and draw. Horsemen in blue and yellow armor of overlapping plates and helmets like huge insects' heads. Shanchan. Several hundred of them, it seemed. From the north. So much for Wyraman's fly. Rand struggled to reach the source. Too late to worry about sicking up or falling on his face. Another time he might have laughed at that. He struggled. It was like fumbling for a pin in the dark with numbed fingers. Time to die, Lews Therin whispered. Rand had always known Lews Therin would be there at the end. Not 50 paces from Rand, screaming Tyrans and Karianan plowed into the Seanchan. "Fight, you dogs!" Anayla shrieked, swinging down from her saddle beside him. "Fight!" The willow lady in her silks and laces hurled a string of curses that would have made a wagon driver's tongue go dry. Anayla stood holding her mount's reins, glaring from the mill of men and steel to Rand. It was Ailil who turned him onto his back. Kneeling there, she looked down at him with an unreadable expression in her big dark eyes. He could not seem to move. He felt drained. He was not sure he could blink. Screams and the clash of steel rang in his ears. "If he dies in our hands, Bashir will hang both of us." Anayla certainly was not simpering now. "If those black-coated monsters get hold of us?" She shuddered and bent closer to Ailil, gesturing with a belt knife he had not noticed in her hand before. A ruby sparkled blood red on the hilt. "Your lance captain could break off enough men to get us away. We could be miles away before he's found, and back to our estates by the time—" "I think he can hear us," Ailil broke in calmly. Her red-gloved hands moved at her waist, sheathing a belt knife or drawing one. "If he dies here—" She cut off as sharply as the other woman had, and her head jerked around. Hooves thundered past Rand on either side in thick streams, galloping north toward the Seanchan. Sword in hand, Bashir barely reined in before leaping from his saddle. Gregor and Panar dismounted more slowly, but he waved his sword at the men flooding by. "Strike home for King and Ilion!" he shouted. "Strike home! The Lord of the Morning! The Lord of the Morning!" The crash of steel rose higher, and the screaming. "It would be like this at the last of it," Bashir growled, favoring the two women with suspicious glares. He wasted only an instant, though, before raising his voice above the din of the battle. "More! Burn your Ashaman hide! Here! Now!" He did not shout that the Lord Dragon was down, thank the light. With an effort, Rand turned his head perhaps a hand. Enough to see Ilianers and Saldeans driving on north. The Seanchan must have given way. "More!" The name roared through Bashir's mustaches, and Moore himself dropped from a galloping horse nearly on top of Anayla. She looked disgruntled at the lack of an apology as the man knelt beside Rand, scrubbing dark hair out of his face. She moved back quickly enough when she realized he intended to channel, though, practically bounding away. Ailil was much smoother about rising, but not noticeably slower in stepping clear. And she slipped a silver-handled belt knife back into its sheath at her waist. Healing was a simple matter, if not exactly comfortable. The fletchings were broken off, and the arrow drawn the rest of the way through with a sharp jerk that brought a gasp to Rand's lips. But that was just to clear the way. Dirt and lightly embedded fragments would fall away as soon up, but only Flynn and a few others could use the power to remove what was driven deep. Resting two fingers on Rand's chest, Moore caught his tongue between his teeth with a fixed expression and wove healing. That was how he always did it. It did not work for him otherwise. It was not the complex weaves that Flynn used. Few could manage that, and none as well as Flynn so far. This was simpler, rougher. Waves of heat rushed through Rand, strong enough to make him grunt and send sweat gushing from every pore. He quivered violently from head to foot. A roast in the oven must have felt that way. The sudden flood of heat ebbed slowly, and Rand lay panting. In his head, Lews Therin panted too. "Kill him! Kill him!" over and over. Muting the voice to a faint buzz, Rand thanked Moore. The young man blinked surprised, then grabbed the dragon scepter from the ground and forced himself to his feet. Erect, he swayed slightly. Bashir started to offer an arm, then backed away at a gesture. Rand could stand unaided. Barely. He could as soon have flown by waving his arms as channeled, though. When he touched his side, his shirt slipped on blood, yet the old round scar and the newer slash across it merely felt tender. half-healed only, but they had never been better than that since he got them. For a moment, he studied the two women. Anila murmured something vaguely congratulatory and offered him a smile that made him wonder whether she intended to lick his wrist. Ailil stood very straight, very cool, as if nothing had happened. Had they meant to leave him to die? Or to kill him? But if so, why send their armsmen charging in and rush to check on him? On the other hand, Ailil had drawn her knife once the talk of him dying began. Most of the Saldaeans and Ilianers were galloping north or riding down the slope of the ridge, pursuing the last of the Seanchan. And then Wyraman appeared from the north, riding a tall, glossy black at a slow canter that picked up when he saw Rand. His armsmen rode in double file at his back. "My lord dragon," the High Lord intoned as he dismounted. He still seemed as clean as he had in Ilion. Bashir simply looked rumpled and a bit grimy here and there, but Gregorin's finery was decidedly dirt-stained and slashed down one sleeve besides. Wyraman flourished a bow to shame a king's court. "Forgive me, my lord dragon. I thought I saw Seanchan advancing in front of the ridge and went to meet them. I'd never suspected this other company. You can't know how it would pain me if you were injured." "I think I know," Rand said dryly, and Wyraman blinked. Seanchan advancing? Perhaps. Wyraman would always snatch at a chance for glory in the charge. "What did you mean at the last, Bashir?" "They're pulling back," Bashir replied. In the valley, fire and lightning erupted for a moment, as if to give him the lie. Slowly to the far end. "Your scouts do say they all do be retreating," Gregorin said, rubbing his beard, and gave Moore a sidelong, uncomfortable glance. Moore grinned at him toothily. Rand had seen the Ilianer in the thick of fighting, heading his men, shouting encouragement and laying his sword about with wild abandon. But he flinched at Moore's grin. Gedwin strode up then, leading his horse carelessly, insolently. He almost sneered at Bashir and Gregorin, frowned at Wyraman as if already knowing the man's blunder, and eyed Ailil and Anila as though he might pinch them. The two women drew back from him hastily, but then so did the men, except for Bashir. Even more. Gedwin's salute to Rand was a casual tap of fist to chest.
Be
"I
right
sent
back,
scouts
everyone.
out as soon as I saw this lot was done. There are 3 more columns inside 10 miles. All headed west," Bashir put in quietly, but he looked at Gedwin sharp enough to slice stone. "You've done it," he told Rand. "They're all falling back. I doubt they'll stop short of Abu Dar. Campaigns don't always end with a grand march into the city, and this one is finished." Surprisingly, or perhaps not, Wyraman began arguing for an advance to "take Abu Dar for the glory of the Lord of the Morning," as he put it. But it was certainly a shock to hear Gedwin say he would not mind taking a few more swipes at these Seanchan, and he certainly would not mind seeing Abu Dar. Even Ailil and Anila added their voices in favor of putting an end to the Seanchan once and for all, though Ailil did add that she would as soon like to avoid having to return to finish. She was quite sure the Lord Dragon would insist on her company for it. That in a tone as cool and dry as night in the Aiel waste. Only Bashir and Gregorin spoke for turning back, and raised their voices they did increasingly as Rand stood silent and staring west, toward Abu Dar. "We did do what we came for," Gregorin insisted. "Light's mercy. Do you think to take Abu Dar itself?" Take Abu Dar, Rand thought. Why not? No one expected that. A total surprise for the Seanchan and everybody else. "Times are you seize the advantage and ride on," Bashir growled. "Other times you take your winnings and go home. I say it's time to go home." "I would not mind you in my head," Luce Theron said, sounding almost sane. "If you were not so clearly mad." Abu Dar. Rand tightened his hand on the dragon scepter, and Luce Theron cackled. Chapter 24. A Time for Iron. A dozen leagues east of Abu Dar, Rocken glided in out of the cloud-streaked sunrise to land in a long pasture marked as the Flyers' Field, poles. The brown grasses had been trampled and scored days since. All of the creature's grace in the air was lost as soon as their claws touched the ground in a lumbering run, leathery pinions 30 paces or more wide held high as if the animal wanted to sweep itself back upward. There was little beauty, either, in the Rocken that ran awkwardly down the field, beating ribbed wings, Flyers crouching in the saddle as if to pull the beast up by main force, ran on until at last they stumbled into the air, wingtips barely clearing the tops of the olive trees at the end of the field. Only as they gained height and turned toward the sun, soared toward the clouds, did the Rocken regain dignified grandeur. Flyers who landed did not bother to dismount. While a groundling held a basket up for the Rocken to gulp full of shriveled fruits by the double handful at a time, one of the Flyers would hand down their scouting report to a still more senior groundling, and the other bent on the other side to receive new orders from a Flyer too senior to handle reins personally very often. Almost that quickly after coming to a halt, the creature was reined around to waddle over to where 4 or 5 others waited their turn to make that long, ungainly run to the sky. At a dead run, dodging between moving formations of cavalry and infantry, messengers carried the scouting reports to the huge red-bannered command tent. There were haughty Tarabonner lancers and stolid Amadisian pikemen in well-ordered squares, breastplates striped horizontally in the colors of the regiments they were attached to. Altaran light horse, in disordered bunches, made their mounts prance, bane of the red slashes crisscrossing their chests, so different from the markings anyone else wore. The Altarans did not know those indicated irregulars of doubtful reliability. Among the Shanshan soldiers, named regiments with proud honors were represented from every corner of the empire. Pale-eyed men from Alkab, honey-brown men from Enkon, men black as coal from Kowial and Dalanshar. Marat Torm, on their sinuous, bronze-scaled mounts that made horses wicker and dance in fright, and even a few Marat Grolm, with their squat, beak-mouthed charges. But one thing that always accompanied a Shanshan army was conspicuous by its absence. The Suldam and the Mani were still in their tents. Captain General Kena Miraj thought of the Suldam and the Mani a great deal. From his seat on the dais, he could see the map table clearly, where helmetless underlieutenants checked the reports and placed markers to represent the forces in the field. A small paper banner stood above each marker, inked symbols giving the size and composition of the force. Finding decent maps in these lands was next to impossible, but the map copied atop the large table was sufficient, and worrying in what it told him. Black discs for outposts overrun were dispersed. Far too many of those, dotting the whole eastern half of the Vanir Range. Red wedges for commands on the move marked the western end as thickly, all pointed back toward Abu Dar. And scattered among the black discs, 17 stark white. As he watched, a young officer in the brown and black of a Marat Torm carefully placed an 18th. Enemy forces. A few might be the same group seen twice, but for the most part, they were much too far apart. The timing of the sightings wrong. Along the walls of the tent, clerks in plain brown coats, marked only with insignia of rank among clerks on the wide collars, waited at their writing tables, pens in hand, for Miraj to issue orders that they would copy out for distribution. He had already given what orders he could. There were as many as 90,000 enemy soldiers in the mountains, nearly twice what he could muster here, even with the native levies. Too many for belief, except that scouts did not lie. Liars had their throats slit by their fellows. Too many, springing out of the ground like trapworms in the Centejor. At least they had 100 miles of mountain yet to cover if they intended to threaten Abu Dar. Almost 200, for the white discs furthest east. And hill country after that for another 100 miles. Surely the enemy general could not mean to let his dispersed forces be confronted one by one. Gathering them together would take more time. Time alone was on his side right then. The entry flaps of the tent swept open, and the High Lady Suroth glided in, black hair a proud crest spilling down her back, pleated snow-white gown, and richly embroidered overrobe somehow untouched by the mud outside. He had thought her still in Abu Dar. She must have flown out by Torakan. She was accompanied by a small entourage, for her. A pair of Death Watch guards with black tassels on their sword hilts held the tent flaps, and more were visible outside. Stone-faced men in red and green, the embodiment of the Empress, might she live forever.
Oh, that's why it's so quiet. My speaker went out.
Passed as if they were as much servants as the lushly-bodied Daccavale in slippers and a nearly transparent white robe, her honey yellow hair in a multitude of thin braids, who carried the high lady's gilded writing desk, a meek 2 paces behind. Siroth, voice of the blood, Olwyn.
Oh, all right, everyone. I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. Excuse me. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.